Welcome to Haven Horizons Lunch and Learn.
I'm Sarah Harte, Planning and Communications Strategist for Haven Horizons. Today I'm in conversation with Christine Doherty about DSGBV media reporting guidelines, which is a topic we are focusing on the spring series of our Lunch and Learn. Christine Doherty has worked both as a freelance reporter and editor and also as a staff reporter at the Business Post and independent news and media's regional titles in the Northeast, including reporting from the local district courts. She's currently undertaking a PhD at Maynooth University. Her doctoral research examines the challenges that journalists face in reporting on DSGBV. She is using the murders of Clodagh Hawe, Jennifer Poole and Ashling Murphy as case studies to examine the socio-political, economic and cultural elements within the reporting, as well as unpacking Irish policy on DSGBV. Her research is driven by her experiences as a journalist, her academic work, and her experiences as a survivor of intimate partner violence. Christine, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Just before I go to my first question, would you just tell us a little bit about your research, the nature of your research? I know you're using, I mentioned there, the three case studies.
Well, my research is primarily rooted in the Istanbul Convention, which is seen as the blue chip of human rights treaties on the prevention and protection of women and girls in terms of domestic violence and abuse. And that is the bedrock of my research. I'll just take this up. In 2014, Ireland ratified the Istanbul Convention. So my research is looking at the years since we ratified the Istanbul Convention and the impact that it has had socially, politically, economically, and culturally on Irish policy, which would be principally the strategies on domestic, sexual, and gender-based violence. I'm using the three case studies as a lens to examine also from those aspects how reporters are challenged when it comes to reporting on domestic, sexual, and gender-based violence in Ireland. So that is at the core of my research.
And I think just before we kind of came online here, you said something very interesting about that you sort of had an epiphany in 2016 during the Clodagh Hawe case. You kind of had a realization that you could have been there in different capacities. You could have been part of that case.
Well, when Clodagh was killed, she was killed at home in August 2016 by her husband, and I don't like to name perpetrators, along with her three sons. And the media coverage in the days after that, I started to realize something, which was not only could I have been one of the local journalists there on the scene reporting about Clodagh, but I also could have been Clodagh because I'm a survivor of intimate partner violence and threats to kill. So that was a moment where I was about to start final year as an undergrad in the Department of Applied Social Science in Maynooth. And I realized that I had this bridge between the journalist, the academic, and the survivor. And so it has driven my research ever since. A woman I never met, but who I could have been or I could have been writing about, she's there in all my research, and she's one of the case studies that I'm exploring from my doctorate studies.
Okay, so you mentioned, so that gives you obviously a very wide lens and a very interesting one, it has to be said, because you're marrying the theoretical with the experiential, and the experiential both in the professional and the personal context. So you talked about the Istanbul Convention there being a bedrock of your research, and that obviously impacts policies, as you said, the national domestic violence strategies. What do you think, Christine, shapes journalists' coverage of DSGBV as things stand?
Well, when I was asked to do this presentation, I went off and had a little look for some research, academic papers. And it's really interesting when you start to look, because if you type in violence against women, media, guidelines, reporting, it comes up with violence against women journalists or women politicians. It doesn't look at the actual reporting on violence against women. or the challenges that journalists might face. So the three pieces of academic research that I've put up there, the third one is Irish, and it's about social media response and the hashtag. Her name was Clodagh. I haven't focused on that today because there just isn't the time. But the other two, the first one, when I went looking for guidelines on research, I found suicide guidelines, responsible reporting on suicide from Germany, that actually interviews journalists. And the other piece of research, which is Irish, actually interviews journalists as well about the challenges that they face when reporting on domestic violence.
And from your own experience as a working journalist who would have been a court reporter, and you would have been in the district courts, what were the challenges that you or others found in reporting on DSGBV?
Well, I'll talk about it later, but there is absolutely no training given. Journalists will be given training from a legal point of view in terms of the structure and what they can say and what they can't say, but they won't be given training on the legislation on domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. And they are operating within very strict parameters, which they then bring back to the office and the copy or the recordings that they produce. But then the other challenges happen structurally within the newsroom. Would you like me to talk about them? The four challenges.
So I'd love to hear about those. So just before you go to those, essentially what you've been saying so far, just to recap, is that one of the challenges, some of the structural challenges for reporters is the actual shape of the law, and
yes,
and the fear of perhaps committing defamation, and strict court guidelines on what you can or can't say. So now you might move in with us to the newsroom and expand that out and tell us what happens in there. You come back with your report of a case, and then there's other fetters on you, if you like.
Yes, well, and I mean, this is from the academic research. I'm taking this, but I think that any journalist would agree with these challenges, which are sources, framing, editorial, and the external supports that they have. So the sources, and this is in terms of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence for journalists, means that there's an over-reliance on the Garda, that it's the facts of the case. And here we go back again to the courts and the law and how editors might see the framing of a particular story. So that leads to them, they go to the guards and the guards say, oh, you know, we don't frame it in a certain way. So they go
the
then
guards,
to...
Sorry, the guards say what?
The guards say, we don't want to frame it in a certain way. We don't want to say it's domestic violence. They might say it off the record or whatever, but the facts are the case are these, and they'll be the very bare bones. And so then the journalists are left with having to go to what the academics call problematic sources, and their local representatives, bystanders, neighbours. And I mean, there's this cultural thing. This is how these are all these four challenges are interwoven. The cultural challenge in Ireland is nobody likes to speak ill of the dead. So you're a reporter and you turn up at a scene and you're looking for somebody to speak about something that's happened, and you know, you're left with all the nice stuff, and you don't get to the nitty-gritty of the story. And then they tend to stay clear of advocates and frontline DSGBV sources, because again, we're talking about the facts. The guards are only
It's interesting. You've said quite a few things there that are very interesting about how the process works. The first bit was the sources. So you seem to suggest, if I understand correctly, that on Garda Síochána right off the bat are reluctant. They may say something off the record, but they're reluctant to frame the issue as one pertaining to domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. That's the first challenge.
Yes.
And then the next challenge is...
Then the next... Sorry, go on.
The next challenge then is in terms of your next set of sources are going to be local sources. And you said there's a cultural thing about not speaking about the dead. So far we have on Garda Síochána, the primary source, they don't want to frame it as domestic violence. Then you're going to local sources, nobody wants to speak ill of the dead. So that leads us then, I presume, down a road where people are saying very nice things about a perpetrator, and domestic violence is being left out of the picture.
Yes, and you can see that in the case of Clodagh Hawe's husband. You know, he was a Eucharistic minister, he was a GAA referee, he was a school teacher. And that led to an awful lot of problems in newsrooms all over the country, because how do you frame and portray that when it goes against all our cultural norms of a perpetrator, that he was completely outside all the stereotypes. So that, according to the academic research, is the reason why Clodagh was rendered invisible in some of the coverage of her murder.
So there, when we're talking about that in the Clodagh Hawe case, and indeed many other cases, we're talking about a widespread cultural societal framing, which is that we don't wish to speak ill of the perpetrator, and that the victim becomes invisible. And so what happens then, as far as you're concerned, in the editorial room? Are there other pressures in there on journalists in terms
Yes,
of?
well, but there's, as I say, there's the framing, and this framing then of DV as a single incident rather than a sequence of pathological behavior, as the research puts it. Okay, so then you're in the editorial, the editor. So the reporter writes the story and writes it, or records the story and sends it in. You know, they can't do whatever they want. It has to be written to a certain style, length, a certain point of view, because as soon as it hits the sub-editor or the editor, it's going to be changed to fit the ethos of that actual media outlet. So there's greater scrutiny by editors on these pieces, because there's potential legal problems. Okay, if in doubt, leave it out. Okay, there's a fear of defamation. Defamation laws in Ireland are very strict. And then there's also the fact of court reporting. Is this going to end up in the court system? Am I going to have a judge come back and pull the editors into court, as has happened, and said to them, you know, you have put this case in jeopardy by previous coverage? So all that feeds into the mix of the story going through the process.
So there's globally there, when you look at that, from the moment when the reporter heads out, there's quite a lot of hurdles to overcome, or there's a lot of fetters on the journalist. Christine, so you obviously were a working journalist, you were working as, you were in the district courts. Since you started this academic research, has your understanding of reporting changed, from when you began and what you know now? Have you particular insights as a result that you didn't have when you started the research?
It's a huge area. It really is. It's very hard to keep on top of it. And I'm just thinking, and when I worked in the Sunday Business Post, there was a sub-editor who had a little cartoon up on the wall, and it was how journalists start their day. And it was like he had a dart, and it was just a grid system, and it was, nuclear physicist, cultural warrior, whatever. It had to be an expert in everything. And, you're just throwing a dart at it. Where the luxury that I have now is, and I think it's brought a greater understanding to me, is I don't work on deadlines the way that I would have when I was a journalist. Everything is about time, particularly now in the internet age. And some of the journalists in those who are quoted in those pieces of research that I've put up have said that you're trying to get ahead of the competition, you're trying to get the most clicks, you're trying to make the most amount of sales of newspapers. And what journalists are trying to do, I think I've a greater understanding and appreciation of the fact that I work to academic deadlines, which, believe me, are not the same, whereas they're working to an hourly or a weekly deadline, and they're just trying to get the stuff done within the system. The research shows that journalists are actually have much more left-wing views than the media outlets that they work for. So there's this balancing this self-censorship that goes on as well in the professional capacity, where they're trying to balance up the two. And I suppose that's what's changed in my understanding, is I have a greater understanding now of the challenges. And
so some of those challenges we've spoken about there, I mean, obviously there's the fear of defamation law, which is very real. Then there's the outlet's own view. Then there's the time constraints. So there's a lot going on there in the working life of a journalist. But what do you think? We have this Lunch and Learn series. We're looking at media guidelines, DSGBV media guidelines, and we're trying to maybe potentially put together a working group to try and formulate some guidelines. That's the aim anyway. What do you think could be done to help address, some of the many challenges you've mentioned there that journalists face when reporting on DSGBV? How could we improve the situation that you've just described?
Well, I think for journalists themselves, well, then you see, when you talk about journalists, that's the generic term. You know, there's the reporter that goes out and writes the story, and then there's the editors. So there's a whole system of people there. So it would be some way of, I suppose, really of changing the culture.
How would you, do you think that the notion of, say, guidelines, you know, you mentioned earlier suicide guidelines, but guidelines and training, you know, what do you think of those notions? I mean, do you think that it's possible to change things, or how would you advocate, having done your research, how we might change things?
Well, I think it was really interesting, and the journalists who were asked about the suicide guidelines in Germany, they said that they didn't like it. They had a problem with freedom of the press. They were professionals, and one of them said they don't understand how journalism works. So I'm just wondering, how do you put in place guidelines? How do you police them? Who operates them? How do they work? Would it not be better to try and change the culture?
Can you
Both
not do,
within,
can you, sorry, continue.
both within journalism and outside. I'm thinking of education. I'm thinking of training. You know, I'm thinking about what may seem like silly things, like soap operas carrying particular storylines. You know, journalists produce, they create content, but they also absorb it. You know, they're part of general society. So I think that the training and the education probably needs to be across the board as much as possible. I know that might sound like it's
No,
an impossibility.
it doesn't sound, it sounds very logical, because what you just referenced there has been, journalists are part of society, whether they're in a newsroom or not. But, you know, when you talk about cultural, really there, what you're referring to are kind of the domestic violence myths that we're all prone to. So surely would that not suggest, as I think you were suggesting there, that the training would have to be across the board, so journalists and editors, but it's about a culture within a newsroom, which is part of a bigger culture that we're all part of.
It's a reflection of Irish culture in general. So, I mean, I'm a big fan of the reflecting and responding to domestic abuse and coercive control course, the level 6 that Haven Horizons runs, which I have examined. And I just, by reading the responses by people who don't work in frontline domestic violence services, who aren't advocates, people who don't work in the criminal justice system, who go in there and have this revelation when they're presented with the information and they're asked about various scenarios, and they learn about red flags and green flags. And I think something like that in a condensed form for journalists, they're very busy people, or just in general. I mean, I recommend that course to everybody, from my local librarian to people that I meet at work who are not connected with it. I think it's about trying to change the culture. I'm also a social anthropologist, so that's probably a little bit to do with it. But it's about changing the culture. And I think while the culture has changed a little bit since Clodagh Hawe was murdered in 2016 in journalism, I think a lot of it is a gloss. And when you scratch that gloss and look underneath it, it's still the same. The structures are still the same. So I suppose what I'm saying is we've got to find some way of getting in and dismantling those structures, of changing the attitudes. We did it with seatbelts, we did it with drink driving. Why can't we do it with domestic violence?
That's an excellent point, and I think it's a very powerful one. I think you mentioned Germany there and media reporting guidelines. I can see why press might be resistant to guidelines, but I presume that's when they're mandatory as opposed to being actual guidelines. You know, they're, like we have suicide guidelines, and you're not obliged to consult them, but presumably people do, you know. I think now I'm going to, because I'm conscious of the time, I'm going to hand you over to our CEO, Madeleine, who might just have a Q&A.
And thank you, Christine. Interestingly enough, you're picking up on some of the points that Susan McKay made last week, where she talked about the fact that it's quite strange that in the education of journalists that they don't have some modules on social issues and how to look at the structural and systemic issues that result in a lot of the issues that they're covering on a daily basis. So that's something that when we were looking at this that I hadn't previously considered, but it's something that we will bring into the working group, and the points you've made as well. And the pieces of research there that you referenced, the 3 pieces, Katerina has popped those into the chat. So if anybody's interested in finding out more about those. And just to say then, before we go to the questions and answers, Katerina's that's the 3, and next week we have Luke Harte. And I think a lot of people are familiar with Luke Harte. His father, Lance Harte, murdered his mother and sister Claire and Charlotte. So he speaks very astutely about the role of the media in covering their case. So, and also that was the key reason that he became an activist in the area, was to try and highlight and address the role of the media. And I've been speaking about this before, where he actually spoke about the fact that he was really concerned that people would have read the headlines around his father, including what he called that guy in Ireland who murdered his wife and 3 children, because his father murdered his mother and sister 6 weeks after Alan Hall. And so listening to Luke will be very, very interesting about the role of the media and how we need to challenge what's happening there. So then, as well as that, Sarah said, the Lunch and Learns are recorded. They're on our YouTube channel. You can check out the rest of our work and information about the course that Christine mentioned, and you can follow us on our social media platforms. Thank you for watching.